Requirements for this lecture are that you've seen the previous network lectures and are understanding of the key concepts for Docker networks and the commands that go with it. All right, in this lecture, you're going to learn and play with DNS and how it affects containers in custom networks and default networks. And we're going to go over quickly how important it is that we have good DNS because you can't rely on IP addresses inside containers since things are so dynamic. And we'll look at the differences between default and custom networks in regards to how they deal with DNS. And then we'll check out the -- link option for container run for enabling DNS on the default bridge network. So there's one more thing that's crucial to all of these containers and virtual networks and them talking to each other, and that's naming. Because in the world of containers constantly launching and disappearing and moving and expanding and shrinking and all the wonderfulness of these microservices that we're seeing crop up everywhere, is that we no longer can easily rely on IP addresses as the way to talk from one thing to the other. Because we can't assume from minute to minute that the IP addresses are even going to be the same. The container might go away, or it might fail and then Docker brings it up somewhere else. It's just too dynamic and too complicated to deal with that. So it turns out that there is a built-in solution for this, and that is DNS naming. And Docker uses the container names as the equivalent of a host name for containers talking to each other. Now, if you remember, we just had two containers running. And if you remember, the new Nginx was on a new network called MyAppNet, right? And it has the one container on it. Now, because I created this new network that's not the default bridge network, it actually gets a special new feature, which is automatic DNS resolution for all the containers on that virtual network from all the other containers on that virtual network using their container names. If I were to create a second container on that virtual network, they'll be able to find each other regardless of what the IP address is with their container names. So let's try this. Docker container run name, and we'll call it my Nginx. And we're going to specify the network as my app net from the Nginx image. So now if we look at that network, we should see two containers. And if I do a Docker container exec from the new container I just created, oops, we also need the IT in there. And we do a ping to the new Nginx, you notice that DNS resolution just works. And this makes it super easy for you to have one container and you need to set a configuration file in it to talk to the, maybe let's say the PHP server talk to the MySQL backend. Control C out of that, and you'll see that it works the other way as well. If I jump into the new Nginx container and I try to ping the my Nginx, you see that the resolution works both ways. And this is what solves a huge problem when you're spinning up containers because you can't predict how long they're going to last and where they might be a minute from now in a production design where you've got a cluster of Docker Swarm servers. So it may not change very much on your local machine, but if you stop 3 or 4 containers and then you start the same containers and you start them in a different order, they may not have the same IP address, but their host names or their container names will always be the same. And so you can rely on them. Now I should note, if we do a Docker network list, the default bridge network has one disadvantage here. It does not have the DNS server built into it by default, so you can use the -- link. So when you create a container, you'll notice there's a link option, and you can actually specify manual links between containers in that default bridge network. But really, it's just much easier to create a new network for your apps so that you don't have to do this every time. And in a future section, when we talk about Docker Compose, you'll see how so much of this gets even easier because Compose automatically will create new virtual networks whenever you spin up an app with it So communicating amongst your containers gets even easier. So just as a quick recap, we covered in this lecture about how containers can't really or shouldn't really rely on IP addresses for talking to each other because they just can't be relied on. And that DNS is really the standard here for how we do intercommunication between containers on the same host and across hosts. And so I recommended you always create custom networks since it's just easier that way than doing the -- link all the time. And then I gave you a teaser about Docker Compose and how it's going to make all this easier, especially the networking.